I can't believe I'm saying this, but this was actually a decent episode. This episode wasn't that bad. Color me surprised. Now, it wasn't that good either. It was just okay, which for the Rings of Power is one hell of an improvement. I think it improved because for the first time this season, the episode focused on storytelling and moving the plot instead of trying to retell the Lord of the Rings. Like I mentioned in previous reviews, the VFX for the show are amazing. There wasn't much in this episode in terms of flash, but there were tons of location shots that looked absolutely fantastic. With the digital compositing, it's hard for me to tell if any of those locations are practical models. It all ends up looking digital, but whether they built massive miniatures or did everything in a computer, it looks good. So good, it rivals what was done in the Hobbit films, and this show is creeping into Lord of the Rings territory. Yeah, it's that good. Now, when it comes to the story, it's mostly okay in this episode. There are still some issues with the plot and lore, but overall, the episode is about setting the board for the upcoming events. In Lindon, Gil-galad plans his attack on Sauron. He receives Celebrimbor's letter, which I forgot to mention in the previous review. It's a ruse by Celebrimbor. The king commanded Celebrimbor to shut down his forge, but Celebrimbor refused. Instead, he wrote a letter claiming that he shut the forge down, and then set about creating the 7 dwarf rings. Gil-galad's commander takes the letter as proof that Sauron is in Mordor, but the ring keeps showing Gil-galad visions of something else, so he hesitates. Eventually, Elrond makes it to Lindon and tells the king about Adar's forces heading to Eregion, but the king refuses to change his plans because the elves don't have the forces to fight Adar and Sauron. Leaving out the bit about the rings giving visions, I thought this worked, although part of it was only because I know the actual story. In the books, the elves only partially recovered from the wars of the First Stage, and Numenor has spread and become powerful, so while the elves are definitely capable of fighting Sauron, they aren't at the height of their powers. If you added in another enemy, like Adar, they probably couldn't fight both of them. But like I said, that works because I know the backstory. The show doesn't give the audience that information, so when Gil-galad says that they can't fight both Adar and Sauron, not only does it sound like Elrond saying that the elves can't fight both Isengard and Mordor, it also sounds like the king is hinting that the elves will join forces with men and dwarves. Technically, that's what happens in the books, so I can't fault the writers for this, but it is done in the laziest way possible. The stakes should be clearer because the tension of the story relies on knowing that info. And then there's a situation with the dwarves, and again, these are the best scenes in the show, and outside of the changes to the lore, they're decently written. King Durin uses a dwarf rings to find a way to bring sunlight back to Khazad-dûm. Turns out that they've been mining just 3 feet from the outside of the mountain, and I gotta say that for people who claim to know so much about mountains and never lose their sense of direction, seems kinda weird that they wouldn't know that they were just a yard from fresh air. But before we move on, I gotta talk about this ring, because this thing looks like Bruh didn't finish his ring pop. The elves are renowned for their elegance and craftsmanship, but the Rings of Power, all of them, look like they made some generic ass rings and slapped a rock on them, and didn't even cut the rock, just put it on the ring unhewn. My high school class ring looks more sophisticated than this. I know it's hard to compete with Weta's designs from the films, but you don't have to go with this basic look. Anyway, King Durin finds the light with the ring because it's kind of telling him where the light is. The ring also allows him to supposedly see where the riches are buried in the mountain. Neither of those are how the dwarf rings work. The rings only make the dwarves greedy and vengeful against anyone who got in their way. The rings otherwise had no effect on the dwarves, either in extending their lives or bending their wills to Sauron's. The show acknowledges the greed part, but seems to suggest that King Durin is prey to whatever Sauron's doing with the rings in the show, even though the dwarves are said to be resistant to this kind of manipulation. That's an unnecessary change that doesn't add anything but more problems for the show. Like I said before, by changing the order of the creation of the rings, the writers created a cascading set of problems for themselves, the biggest being that nobody should trust the rings. The rings are obviously affecting people's behavior, so why would anyone continue to use them? It's especially bad with the elves because they're supposed to be wise, and using rings that might be under the influence of the great evil of their time is a very unwise thing to do. With the dwarves, the situation is worse because Durin flat out tells the king not to trust the rings immediately after telling him to use the rings. So now King Durin becomes possessive of the ring, as if it's precious to him, and while that's technically true to the lore, it doesn't help with the other characters. A good rule of thumb in storytelling is to not make your characters look stupid, but the show breaks this rule because everyone who's encountered a ring of power knows something's off about them, but they keep using the rings. In the book, no one knew there was anything off about the rings, and the rings were given out by Celebrimbor as gifts over a course of 1,000 years. By the time anyone noticed the rings had a negative impact, it was either too late or just looked like the person had changed over time. It didn't necessarily make people think it had anything to do with the rings. Another key element is that Sauron doesn't know where all the rings are because Celebrimbor was the one giving them away, which is why he tortures Celebrimbor to find out the locations of the rings. The show, however, inverts the creation process, so now Sauron knows who has the 3 elven rings, which he was never supposed to know, and at least one of the dwarf rings, which totally breaks the lore. Now, speaking of breaking the lore, all this digging awakes Balrog under Khazad-dûm. Disa randomly bumps into it when looking for a stone she dropped. She tells Durin, and when Durin tries to tell the king about it and implore him to stop digging, his father ignores him. The scene in and of itself is fine. There's just one lore problem. The Balrog doesn't awaken until the Third Age. It's asleep for the entirety of the Second Age. So why are they changing this? Why are they putting a Balrog in the show? Well, 1, because The Lord of the Rings had a Balrog, and 2, the dwarves did dig for mithril in the Second Age, and according to the books, it was the digging for mithril in the Third Age that awoke the Balrog. That's it. There's no other reason for it to be here. And while we're talking about lore, we get the scene with Narvi and Celebrimbor where they show off the doors of Durin. That's fine. This is the time frame for when the doors were created. I do have one question though. How come we can see the carvings? If the Athildin was already used, then the door should look like bare stone. I'm going to give the show the benefit of doubt and say that the Athildin wasn't added in yet. Otherwise, that's kind of a silly error. Not as bad as, say, not making Glamdring glow for the entirety of the Jackson films, but an error nonetheless. That brings us to Celebrimbor and Discount Jesus, who's working his magic on the elves in the most obviously shady way possible. Everything about this dude gives off villain vibes, but the elves just go along with this. Annatar is pissy that Celebrimbor won't make rings for men, and the show never explains exactly why Celebrimbor is so convinced that men would be corrupted by the power of the rings. It's one of those things where the audience knows this, so they put it in the show, but it's never properly set up. Discount Jesus decides he'll make the 9 rings himself. Celebrimbor tries to talk him out of it, but it doesn't work. Celebrimbor is clearly starting to suspect that something's off about Annatar, but this situation alone should make him way more suspicious. Why is Annatar so hell-bent on making rings for men? A normal person would ask this before letting Annatar go on, but Celebrimbor just lets Annatar have his way. It gets worse when Short Round uses one of the rings and it turns her invisible. Celebrimbor manages to get the ring off of her, and she explains that she's seen the unseen world and also a figure wreathed in flames. Obviously this is Sauron, but what makes this so strange is that the elves who lived in Valinor, like Celebrimbor, can see both the seen and unseen world. So he should have been able to at least see an aspect of this woman when she wore the ring, and if this woman was born in the Undying Lands, she should have been able to do this too. Likewise, if Sauron's true form is visible in the unseen world, then they should both be able to see it without using the ring. Incidentally, this would also apply to Galadriel, meaning Strong Woman should have seen right through Halbrand the entire time. But then again, she is the dumbest woman in the world. Now, to be clear, that's not how Sauron worked in the books, but since the show isn't clear on what carries over from the books, it leads to potential problems like this. Speaking of problems, apparently it's the mithril that makes people invisible. To prevent men from being corrupted by the rings, the elves added in more mithril, and that led to the invisibility. That's interesting because there's nothing in the books that say that mithril has anything to do with making things invisible. Ithildin is invisible because of Celebrimbor's art, not the mithril. Also, Ninya, Galadriel's ring, is the only ring set to be made of mithril, and it doesn't make her invisible when she wears it. She wears it with Frodo and Sam at the mirror, and Sam can see her the whole time. Also, other things made of mithril, like Frodo's coat, Ardendir's ship, and from the show, Finrod's dagger, none of those make people invisible either. It's just another weird inconsistency caused by an unnecessary change. So, after this happens, Durin comes to tell Celebrimbor that there's something wrong with the dwarf rings because his father is acting strange. We later see this when the king talks to Narvi and goes full Bilbo on him over the ring. The ring is changing his behavior so much that it's making him reverse his own plans and rules, like reversing his ban on digging deeper into the mountain. Celebrimbor denies that anything's changed in the making of the rings, so Durin suggests that maybe it's Annatar that caused the problem, and for some reason, Celebrimbor writes this off, even though he's already suspicious of Onatar. Now, this just makes him look stupid. It's obvious something's wrong with the rings, obvious that Discount Jesus is acting strange, and obvious that this is all happening too fast. Everyone seems to realize this, but they're all just plowing ahead. Onatar literally says this to Celebrimbor later, after the elf realizes that he's screwed if he admits to Gil-galad that there's something wrong with the rings, and that he kept making more of them.
It is either that, or we plunge straight on, even deeper into the maelstrom.
Discount Jesus also whispers in the ear of Short Round, telling her that the figure she saw was Celebrimbor, who's been affected by the shadow. This plays into Onatar's hand when Celebrimbor decides to make the 9 in an effort to correct the mistakes of the 7. He comes across as unhinged, but again, Celebrimbor seems to suspect that Onatar is manipulating him, which he flat out said when Onatar pressed him to make rings for men the first time.
It is a game you play, is it not? Sowing seeds in others' minds and then convincing them that the fruit is of their own thought.
Again, this makes Celebrimbor look incredibly gullible and stupid to fall for this. The scenes are all well performed, and the writing is okay, it's just that the overall plot is dumb. Finally, we get more setup in Numenor, and honestly, these scenes feel like a completely different show. It's not just a different location, the tone is different. I will give the show credit, the scenes are decently written, the actors are doing their thing and come across as believable. It's just that I'm not invested in any of these characters because the show's done a poor job of making them interesting. Pharazôn has been made king off-screen and sets his son on the faithful followers of the Valar. Meanwhile, the former queen pleads with Elendil to get him to tell her what he saw in the Palantir. Remember, when she's used it, she's only seen the destruction of Numenor, but Elendil says that what he saw was his son Isildur near a city he didn't recognize. The queen takes this to mean that what she saw might not come to pass. She urges Elendil to do everything he can to make sure that his vision comes true. Unfortunately, Pharazôn isn't having that, so all the faithful are stripped of their ranks, leaving Elendil without a ship, a crew, or any status. His daughter Aarion sides with Pharazôn, so Elendil basically disowns her. Later on, he and some others pray at a shrine of the Valar, and Pharazôn's son comes in to shut it down. He gets into a fight with one of Isildur's friends, who initially gets the upper hand and breaks Pharazôn's son's arm, but when Elendil commands the guy to stand down, Pharazôn's son stabs the guy in the back. Like I said, this section of the show is okay. It's not bad, but it's not great either. This could not carry the show. It needs other stuff around it to hold it up, which is sad because The Fall of Numenor is a very interesting story. The show could have been about that, and if it were well written, they could have gotten lots of stories out of that before bringing in Onatar corrupting Pharazôn and leading to the fall, but I think that's expecting too much. The episode ends with Adar telling Strongwoman that he didn't capture her as a prisoner, but instead to be a potential ally against a mutual foe, Sauron. Again, I was surprised that this episode was actually okay. There's still some lore issues, but plot-wise, the episode worked. The pacing is still ridiculous though. Who's editing this? Have you no sense of time? Seriously, 5 minutes feels like 20 minutes. Cut the scenes shorter, for the love of God. Putting that aside, if the season was written like this episode, the show would be much better. That said, this was episode 5. There are only 3 episodes left, and the show is still a mess. I try not to watch or read reviews while I'm reviewing something, but I couldn't help but see some of the mainstream critics talk about the show, and they all said the same thing. It's painfully slow, the dialogue is very put on, and the show doesn't stick the landing. And I gotta agree. We're mostly through the season, and the show feels like it wants to be this epic tale, but it never reaches that point. It's not on the same level as House of the Dragon, let alone The Lord of the Rings, and it's looking like the Rings of Power will never get there. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.